Well, this is our final week of going through the Lord's Prayer together, and so we're focusing on the final phrase, which is actually not part of the Lord's Prayer as it's given to us in Luke's Gospel, for example. It's actually probably something that the church added later on. And we have to remember that saying, "For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever," which sounds very triumphant, that's coming from the church's experience of Jesus post crucifixion, post resurrection, post ascension. When Jesus was teaching the Lord's Prayer in the 11th chapter of the Gospel of Luke to his disciples, he's journeying towards Jerusalem and the cross. So it's very appropriate and fitting that he would end that prayer by saying, "Save us from the time of trial," because he knew the trial that he was going to be facing. But the church, again, in light of the resurrection and ascension and the coming of the Spirit and all, added that phrase, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever." So this week in our devotions, we'll be talking about those three things: the kingdom, the power, and the glory, all of which belong to God alone. And our verse for today is very simply from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 11, where Paul is pleading with the church, and he says, "Urging and encouraging you and pleading that you lead a life worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory." So again, here we have a verse repeating two of those three things that we hear in the Lord's Prayer, that God calls us into his own kingdom and glory. And that's really important because there are all kinds of kingdoms. Dallas Willard, in his very significant book, The Divine Conspiracy, which is not an easy book to read, but it's very deep and very rich, he talks about how each person is actually a kingdom. And we all decide how we will use our kingdom and how our kingdom will ally with other kingdoms. And of course, Dallas Willard is making the point that we want to ally our kingdom with God's kingdom, that we serve God's kingdom alone. And we know in the world in which we live, people worship a lot of things other than God. People can worship the nation of which they are a part. They can worship, even raise a leader to a position where it's idolatrous, how they regard another human being. And God does not want to share God's kingdom, God's power, or God's glory with anyone or any nation or country or organization. And what Paul is urging in 1 Thessalonians is that you and I, and he uses urging, encouraging, and pleading, lead a life worthy of God in every respect. And that's what you and I are called to do. And so we'll be talking about that throughout this week, of what does a life that's devoted to God, that's worthy of God's kingdom and power and glory, what does that look like? And it begins with not committing the sin of idolatry, of putting anything or anyone in the place that belongs to God alone.